Welcome to Global Vision. I'm extremely happy to speak today with Alan Rubin, and I would like to welcome you, Alan, and thank you so much for talking with us today about meteorites and about moonstones and all of these things.
Very happy to be here.
Thank you. I would like to know, who is Alan Rubin? Tell us a little bit about your background and how did you get into the field of geology?
Well, that's sort of a long story. When I was a little boy, my older brother used to read science books to me, and the thing that fascinated me most was astronomy. So from the time I was about 5 or 6 years old, I said, I'm going to be an astronomer. And indeed, I became an astronomy major. But while I was studying there, I took a class in geology. And when I went to graduate school, the only thing I could think of at the time that combined both geology and astronomy was meteorites. And so for my master's and PhD, I studied meteorites. And since the mid-70s, I've been a meteorite researcher studying almost nothing else.
Wonderful. And this marriage between astronomy and geology, how it came about? It is such a career, or is something that you put these two together? I mean, I would like to know more about that.
Sure. Well, meteorites are fascinating because they're objects from the asteroid belt and the moon and Mars that come to Earth for free. So you don't even have to send billion-dollar spacecraft missions to any of these bodies because we can collect them. And now there are about 67,000 meteorite specimens that have been recovered and are in the world's collections. It's an interesting field because since meteorites are rocks, they need to be studied by the same principles as scientists who study rocks, which are geologists, geochemists. But because they're from space, you also need to know about solar system processes, about how the planets work, how the various orbits around the sun, about impact cratering, collisions between bodies, and it takes you into the realm of astronomy and geophysics and celestial mechanics. So there's a whole panoply of different disciplines, which is exciting, which are required to understand these rocks more fully.
What is celestial
mechanics?
Mechanics. I never heard that term before.
Well, it goes back to simple like Newtonian mechanics. When high school students take physics, they learn how bodies move and how they collide with one another and they impart energy from one to the other. And celestial mechanics is just doing the same thing in the solar system among asteroids and planets.
Okay, and what is a meteorite exactly?
A meteorite is a natural extraterrestrial body that reaches the surface of the Earth or a different planet. Usually it's a piece of an asteroid that's knocked off that asteroid by the collision of another asteroid or meteorite, and it sends it into an independent orbit around the sun, and some small fraction of these collide with the Earth. Many of them are destroyed in the atmosphere as meteors. You might see bolides or fireballs in the sky, and many of these fragment. Most are lost. Those that do survive, 2/3 go into the water, into the ocean, but a few manage to land on the surface of the Earth and are eventually recovered. And then we can study these bodies. There's about 100, 150 different asteroids that are represented among the meteorites, bodies that spacecraft will never get to, and you also have rocks from the moon and from Mars.
Wow, interesting. And when the humans became interested in meteorites and the moonstones and Mars stone, it is something that, because I know that recently I came about with the interest, but it's something that it's historically has been always there, or what is your experience according with your studies?
Well, actually, it goes back thousands of years, because in many parts of the world, there is no source of iron. The Egyptians would find occasionally an iron meteorite, and they would use the metal for metalworking, for making implements. The Native Americans in Alaska and Greenland, well, they're not Americans there, but the native peoples would find occasionally iron meteorites, and they'd use these again to make harpoons or spears. And so the utility of the iron meteorites, when iron was a material that was not accessible, was being used for many years. Then occasionally there's a meteorite that landed in Japan around 800 AD, and that was preserved in a Shinto shrine, and it's still preserved today. The oldest meteorite from Europe that's been preserved is from Germany from 1492, and meteorites were not recognized as bodies that were extraterrestrial, that came to the Earth from outer space until the late 18th century. Then by that time, the element nickel had been discovered, and they realized that these meteorites that people had reported, these rocks that people had reported to have fallen from the sky, had nickel, which is a rare element at the Earth's surface. And so, they must be very similar, and there were credible reports of rocks falling from the sky. And then they realized that they had some chemical commonalities, and the phenomenon of meteorites as extraterrestrial samples became more widespread. And there've always been, since that time, people studying them, but not many. It's still a minority field. There's maybe about 1,000 people, professionals and amateurs in the world, who are members of the Meteoritical Society, and just some 100 or 200 people in the world who are sort of professional meteorite researchers.
Wow, incredible. And what is the interest that recently has been raised that to the point that Christie's make this bidding? And what is the profile also of the people who are seeking that, the collectionists?
Well, people collect most anything. There are people who are interested in coins and stamps and old spoons and lamps. So people will collect anything depending on what their particular interests are. But meteorites are particularly exciting because they're not from the Earth. They're from the moon, they're from Mars, they're from asteroids, and therefore they're exotic. They hold information about the origin of the solar system and the origin of the moon and the geological history of Mars. And so they're of great scientific interest, and that is very enticing to many people. Like, how many kids look at the spacecraft and saying, I want to be an astronaut, I want to go and study, and I want to learn about these very exciting objects because it's very cool. And so meteorites bring that same kind of cool to anybody who wants to be a collector, because they can actually hold in their hands a moon rock, hold in their hands a piece of the planet Mars, hold in their hands pieces of asteroids that date back to before the Earth was formed. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, but some of these meteorites predate Earth by a few million years. And so around before there was a planet that we can now live on. And so these rocks hold clues. And that's what's exciting to me as a scientist. These rocks hold clues to the origin of the solar system and how the various processes were around that formed the planets and the other bodies.
And how many, can you explain us a little bit the main the varieties that they have, and what is the difference between a moonstone and from Mars and an asteroid?
Sure. Well, we know that meteorites from the moon are indeed from the moon because we have moon rocks brought back to the Earth by the Apollo astronauts and back by a few Soviet Luna missions back in the 60s, and we can compare them directly. And so these are rocks that are blasted off the moon by other meteorite impacts. Mars rocks, again, they're from the planet Mars. It's interesting how we know that, because here's how we know they're from Mars. Back in 1976, the US had 2 Viking missions which landed on Mars, and they analyzed the Martian atmosphere right there on the ground on Mars. And a couple of these meteorites, which were peculiar, they have little bubbles, little impact melts in them when they were blasted off the planets. And while they were in a hot state, some atmosphere got trapped inside these little melts. And so the scientists at NASA in Houston analyzed the gas trapped in these bubbles and found it to be exactly the same composition as the Martian atmosphere measured in 1976 by the Viking missions on Mars. So we know these samples are from Mars. And then these samples are also alike because their isotopic compositions are unique to them. Like, so getting a little technical here, oxygen has 3 stable isotopes with different amounts of neutrons in them, and they have different proportions in different samples. And those on the Earth have one set of ratios among these different isotopes, and the meteorites on Mars have a different set. So when we look at those and we measure them with a machine called a mass spectrometer, we can see that they have a unique set of compositions, and therefore they belong together as a set, and they're different from Earth rocks. Asteroids have yet a different set of oxygen isotope signatures, and different sets. There are many different ones, each one with their own unique set of signatures and chemical compositions, and other isotopic compositions, and mineralogical compositions and textures. So we can study these things and try to intuit how they may have formed.
Wow. And what determines exactly the value? How do you know that one has more value than another?
Well, it's all just what the demand is. Now, first, there's different kinds of value. Let's talk about scientific value.
Mhm.
Scientific value is if it's a rare type of meteorite, then it'll give us more scientific information than a common one because there's not so many of them and we don't have enough material to go around. Also for science, and it's also true for the commercial value as well. If something is common, obviously the law of supply and demand means that there's a lot of them and their price is going to be very high. So the two of them sort of go hand in hand. So if it's a rare type of meteorite, it's worth more commercially and scientifically. If it's a fresh fall, if it just fell from the ground and you picked it up, then it's worth more than one that's been sitting around on the ground getting weathered away for hundreds of years and is all rusty. Fresh, it's worth more. And if it's, and it also depends on how much of the material there is. Again, if a rock weighs 100 kilograms, then the price per gram will be a lot lower than a rock that has a total weight of only 1 kilogram, for example. So the weight available, again, supply and demand, the freshness of the specimen and its rarity determine how valuable a specimen is, both scientifically and commercially. Now, the way the system works, there's sort of this interplay between meteorite dealers who buy meteorites from people who find them, the scientific community who studies these things, and the collectors. Now, there's overlap between it because some scientists are collectors, some meteorite dealers are collectors, but most collectors are neither scientists nor dealers. They just have a collection of meteorites, which they find very interesting. So what happens is that a meteorite may fall in some remote country, let's say some village in Africa, and then the meteorite dealers will descend upon that village with pockets full of cash, and they will start buying these meteorites from the local village inhabitants. That happens all the time. And then they bring the meteorites back to the Western world, to the United States or Europe, for example, and they will go and start selling them. And they don't know what kind of meteorite they are, however, until they come to a scientist. Now, the scientists say, the scientists will determine what kind of a meteorite it is, and that also determines its commercial value. But the scientists demand a piece of the meteorite for their institutional collections in order, as the price for characterizing it, because it takes time and money to analyze a specimen. So here at UCLA, where I am, we typically require just a modest fee, like $120 to analyze a meteorite, but we need 20 grams of it for our collection, assuming it's big enough for that. There's so many of the common meteorites that we don't even bother here anymore for the garden variety. We just want ones that are more rare for it to be worth our time. But anyway, this is how it works. So the scientists get will analyze the specimen. They'll get a piece for their institutional collection. The formal meteorological society will approve the name, and then the name becomes official. It's approved. The scientists get a piece for their collection. The dealers then know how to set the price, and the collectors get to pay the bill.
Oh.
And that's how the system generally works.
And in UCLA, what kind of class? I know that you teach geophysics, you teach different classes, but for the students to really get to know what you know, what they really need to do.
Well, I teach planetary science for the most part, but we do have classes in geophysics and geochemistry. I'm a geochemist myself. And in order to get into this field, you need it depends on what you're going to do. Of course, there's so many different types of fields that pertain to meteorites. I mean, some of my colleagues have never taken a course in geology and are physicists or astrophysicists who just worry about how various bodies or objects may have been made or been processed in the solar system. Others are isotope geochemists who will just measure the fine details of the isotopic compositions of various minerals in the meteorites. And others are what we call petrologists, who will just look at the sample and try to figure out how it formed, what the texture of the rock is, what the mineral compositions are, what the bulk chemical composition is, and how these things tell us information about the rock. Now, students will need to be familiar with all these things, so they have to take a lot of these courses, but the best job asset is experience. So I've had an undergraduate student some time ago who worked with us, and so I just worked with the fellow, and I said, here, you look at this in the microscope and record what you see, and this is how you use this technique, and this is how you use that technique. And he learned how to use the different analytical instruments, and we talked together, and that gave him sort of the hands-on experience to learn how to do it. And again, like any apprenticeship, you learn by doing, and as you get more knowledgeable and more experienced, then you become more expert in being able to analyze samples and understanding what they're telling you.
And just to conclude, what is how do you foresee the industry moving forward, the future? You think it will grow? What do you see right now?
Well, there's only going to be growth because there's more spacecraft going to more asteroids and having more sample return missions. There'll be people, younger people than me, who are going to have to go into these fields and analyze the specimens being brought back by spacecraft. The Japanese have a Hayabusa 2 spacecraft bringing back samples. Now we have other spacecraft sample return missions that are in the works. Some are operating right now, and they're going to bring samples back, and people have to know how to study these. Meteorites will continue to fall. A lot of meteorites are collected in Antarctica and the Sahara, and these have given us new groups of meteorites, new kinds of meteorites. And so the field is only going to grow as our knowledge of the solar system becomes more complete.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for having the time to speaking with us today. For me, it has been extremely educational. I didn't know anything about the subject in particular, but right now, I think thanks to you, I find it fascinating.
Well, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Alan.
Okay, thank you.